Hello, lovely, lovely human beings. What a pleasure, as always, to see you here. I've seen folks checking in from all over the world. We've got Melissa over in Houston. We've got folks in Wetherby, Norwich, Kenilworth, Yorkshire. Richard, so my heritage, or my granddad is from Yorkshire, and Richard in the chat has placed Yorkshire in capital letters, which is the most Yorkshire thing I've ever seen. It's a real pleasure to see you all here today. Thank you all so much for taking the time. If you haven't already, drop in the chat feature where you're watching from, just like Judy has over in Florida. Uh, Eleanor has in Yorkshire, Neil in North London, and so many more of you. Thank you all so much for taking the time today. Um, Today we have two absolutely fabulous guests, two great humans who I've only just really had the opportunity to spend a little bit of time with, but nonetheless, the warm vibes are emanating from today. I think we're going to have a lot of fun. So today we have Digger Zetterberg-Oud from Frontify and Patrick Camp from Siegel and Gale to come and help us on the important topic of brand consistency and how to get the rest of the team on board. It's one of those things which, when I was curating this season, it started to think about how this could be a trivial topic, and then I was like, no, you know what? This is blooming important, and so we're going to have a lot of fun taking some time exploring this together today. And I just want to check in with the chat and say hey to Lois in Manchester, Melanie in Northern Ireland, Dean in London. It's such a pleasure to have you here today. If you have questions throughout today's session, do drop them into the Q&A feature. That's found down below. Today we'll operate as a pure Q&A, so we've got the opportunity to really explore this topic together. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you to our featured sponsor this week. So our featured sponsor this week is a company called ScoreApp. They enable you to create marketing funnels through quizzes, and in this case, we've got an offer for them. So if you want to take the opportunity to check out ScoreApp, you can get 50% off your first month at the QR code on screen. Also, a big thank you to Frontify, Cambridge Marketing College, Planable, Redgate, and ScoreApp for sponsoring today's session. I can see that I'm getting some stick in the chat here from the community. I shared an anecdote this morning that quite recently I went into Canva and created my own piece of branded merch with my own handwriting, negating the lovely branded material that we have today. And yeah, I got rightly pillared to post by my branding guy, who told me that it should never be seen outside. So this is what the chat is right now, Digger and Patrick. So that's yeah, and thank you, Nicole. Right, let's get going with the questions because that's enough of me chatting. As Ian rightly said, I am suffering from man flu right now, so I'm being very brave today. So, Digger, let's start with you. Why is brand consistency important to you? You know, I mean, this thing isn't trivial, but why isn't it trivial to sort of show up with our brands in a consistent way?
Well, I mean, I think for any brand, it's important, of course, and I guess for us specifically, obviously, that's a huge part of why Frontify, the platform, exists in the first
Mhm.
place. It's to help companies and brands be consistent by kind of enabling people to have access to everything that they need. But on kind of a broader level, of course, brand consistency is important for business, basically. I mean, you need to have, it's very basic in that sense. It's like you need to be recognizable and you need to get people to kind of have the right um, kind of connection and emotions evoked when, when they see your brand, because that will translate into business. So, I mean, that's in its simplest form. And then obviously we're going to go deeper into all the details and intricacies of that, I guess, as we, talk here. But that's how I would kind of summarize it, I guess.
Nice. I love it. You know, I think it's always important with these kinds of sessions to to lay the table stakes. So it might sound, like the most basic of questions, but I think it's just important, when we start these things to go,
It's important, but it's not easy, right?
yeah, exactly. Well,
Yeah,
that is right. And so I know at Siegel and Gale, it's actually a really great segue. So you've done a really good job for me there to go in segueing into Patrick
you're
here because
welcome. Welcome.
Siegel, Siegel and Gale speak about simplicity and in brands. But the whole point of simplicity is that simple isn't easy, Patrick. And so I guess I want to ask you the same question to start off with is why is brand consistency important? But I guess it would be really interesting to sort of have that idea that this is a simple concept, but not necessarily simple to implement in mind.
Exactly. And I think that's a great combination, because at least for us, we can't get to consistency without talking about clarity. And I think that's where simplicity comes in, is understanding what your brand is about. So is it clearly understood by the stakeholders? And only then, if you have a very clear point of view of what you're about, what you stand for, what you stand by, then you're able to repeat it consistently across the passing of time. I think Diggy made a great point in equating consistency with financial value or business results. And I think that's exactly what happens when you're able to do it successfully. It's not just about the recognition per se and how people are able to identify your brand easier, but then about credibility as well. It just feels more professional. It equates to trust. People are more likely to gravitate towards your brand because it just feels properly made. Oh, I don't have a dog.
Wait, let's stop the webinar. This is
Uh,
important.
Let's talk about this instead.
I lost the audience. I lost the audience. I don't have a
Yeah.
dog.
This is my old Spanish mutt who just joined us. I don't know if he has any opinions about branding, but maybe. I think he was just like, are you gonna go to bed? Go lie down.
And
Sorry.
just to
Sorry about that,
finalize,
Patrick.
no problem, no
Yeah.
problem. I'm used to that. Just to
Yeah.
finalize the point, there's also a last thing about consistency, which is familiarity, right? And
Mhm.
again, people just tend to trust and feel more comfortable and feel more safe around brands or any types of communications that they feel are more consistent across the different touch points or how they interact with the brands, how they experience the brands. So yeah, it's something that is very important. But again, nothing that I said matters if you don't have that first point of understanding what it's about and having a very clear point of view about the brand.
Spot on. And I think there's a really important point there, which is that the language you use to sort of describe brand there, it's one of these concepts where on one level it can feel like it's a marketing concept, but what both of you have done here is express it as a business concept. It's something that is not, important just to us, it's important to everyone, which is really the spirit of this conversation, which is getting everyone involved with it and understanding the importance of it. Not just us, as a three chatting in this conversation and the hundreds watching in, but, sort of really involving other people as part of this conversation. And so, Patrick, I'd like to follow up with you if possible, which is what are the hallmarks of a team that you've experienced or seen who clearly understand, brand consistency amongst the team? And are there any signs of teams where you're like, oh, I've walked into this environment and I probably realized that they're not going to understand the importance of brand consistency here?
Yeah, two things come to mind, and I would
Mhm.
just circle back on the thing about clarity with an anecdote, an interview from Johnny Ive
Mhm.
a long time ago. Johnny Ive, ex-VP of design for Apple, and he mentioned that it finally dawned on him. He finally understood how Apple was such a company that lived and breathed the culture of the brand. When he got into an elevator in the Apple campus a long time ago, and he listened to a finance guy speaking with some procurement guy about a feature of a product or something along the lines of the technology that they were just launching. And it wasn't a marketeer, it wasn't a designer, it wasn't people who were dealing with the product per se. It was, sometimes a distant department, somebody that has no, no connection, right, to the creation of things. But he talked in that interview about how sophisticated the dialogue was, and he was just kind of hearing. I don't even think that people saw him in the elevator, but he was kind of hearing and just, "Oh, okay, fine," and he finally got it. So clarity is, of course, amongst the team and amongst the others, broader set of stakeholders in the company is something key. The second thing for me is the ability to think long term.
Mm.
Consistency. Consistency is not something that you do like a one-off thing. It's not a monthly thing. It's not even a campaign thing. Is a yearly and decade-long thing. And that is why brands become iconic because you're able to maintain that level of consistency and being recognized and being identified across the passing of time. So I think those two are the key traits from any team if you're thinking about consistency.
Love that. And that long-term mindset is something which, particularly in the brand debate, works on so many different levels, whether we're speaking about tactical implementations of marketing, et cetera, et cetera. But, that long-term thinking, I love that point. And I think it goes such a long way. There was a quote a long time ago from one of our speakers who said that most businesses, if you planted an acorn and expected to see it, results tomorrow, then you're going to struggle. But in 100 years, you're going to get a great oak tree. And in a similar way, brands kind of work that way. They go, could I come to you with, we've established up front that Frontify, you know, really help teams do exactly this thing. So what are the common challenges that you sort of encounter? I guess probably particularly at the beginning where people probably start working with you in maintaining brand consistency across teams. Because I'm assuming that, of the folks watching in today, most of us probably have the same 5 to 10 challenges when it comes to brand consistency and actually sort of bringing
Yeah.
it to life.
I mean, yeah, I think that's the conversation that we have with all of our customers and the agencies that we work with. It's funny, I remember speaking once to someone from an agency, and he said it's so sad when you've created this brand and it's kind of like your baby, and then you hand it over and you watch it get bastardized by others, and it hurts.
Yeah.
And obviously, we're like there to try to like make that not happen. But I mean, I think on the so basically for brands, what we see happen a lot of times, and the most common pain point is like you have a brand team, which is usually a bit smaller, and then they're just bombarded with requests and they have to kind of police things. And you just have this
Mm,
like broken workflow where people they don't have easy access to the materials basically that they need to just live the brand. But I think another thing that quite often comes up is that there's like an increasing need for collaterals basically, because most people aren't designers, so they don't feel fully like some people like you maybe feel comfortable like
I
creating
should.
something, designing themselves, something for themselves. Um, but others kind of want to have more material. So there's also like this increase in getting it's almost like the brand is almost like a shiny toy to people too. Like they want to have the materials that they can use. And we hear that, and I see that too internally in our company, that sales and all these other teams, they want more and more like, oh, can I have like 5 different versions of this deck? And can I have this? And can I have that? And so I think a lot of what brand teams need to do today is kind of like cater to that need.
Mm,
And it's tough because it's a complex workflow and it kind of forces, brand teams and marketing teams to create a lot of material. And then obviously you don't want that to go to waste. So it's kind of like this balance of having like a very clear, simple structure where people can access that, but also giving them the tools, whether that's like templates or whatever it is, to kind of give them just the right amount of kind of co-creation capabilities, I would say. So it's kind of like a little bit of a balancing act in like how do you give people enough, but kind of still maintain the consistency again. So I think that's the challenge that we see, and that's what like the people that do it well are the ones that manage to kind of like really handle that.
But that in itself is really interesting in the sense that I think coming into today's session, we probably all, a lot of us on the call would have that shared experience of either someone going rogue with the branding or, you know,
Bastardizing, yeah.
yeah, bastardizing exactly, um, which is terrible. But I love what I loved from your answer there is there's actually a real reframe from a policing into a more of a proactivity sort of standpoint and a providing, from policing to providing, which feels generous in a way and doesn't sort of remove some of the heat from the conversation where folks can be like, you're using this wrong to,
Yeah.
can I provide you with the right thing? Or, you know what, actually you have access here, which again, it sounds like an easy thing, but we've established this isn't easy. And so to sort of have that available is
Yeah.
really, really important. I think we need to drop this because my co-founder is in the chat saying he'll send me the logos
Let's
to see
go
how we start.
wild with it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So really, really important. Thank you, and to sort of speak to those challenges, I think we'll come back to those throughout the course of today's session. So thank you very, very much. So Patrick, like the role of Siegel and Gale, of course, is to roll out brands and create brands and create simple brands that make sense. How can we let's start getting into the practicalities of getting people involved and implementing these things and so I think a rollout moment is probably a nice moment to speak about in terms of branding. So how do you get other team members sort of inspired to care about this stuff when it comes to branding and maybe rebranding, but more branding in general?
Yes, yes, yes. Just circling back to something that Diggy mentioned just now, it's not about being the brand police,
Hmm.
and it's less about control and more about inspiring and then making sure that people can become ambassadors of the brand,
Hmm.
which internally inside a company can take forms in several different ways. One of the ways that we help clients do it is through training and through what we call it a brand-led change program that internally we understand what are the things culturally that need to be in place to be able to absorb this new brand. And we work together with several different teams, not just the marketing team, but HR and finance and so on and so forth, to be able to make them understand what this new brand is about
Hmm.
and what's expected from them, how they're able to then live and breathe the brand internally, because the brand is, it should have a coherence of how it is expressed externally, how your customers and consumers see it, but also how your employees live it, right? They need to be the first line of defense of the brand. And we work with them, work with their teams to be able to provide that level of training and brand-led change internally.
Nice, I love that, and that role of training seems so important at every level, whether it's a rebrand moment or indeed, like a new joiner coming in. Again, using this sort of idea that the brand is there as a business mechanism rather than just a marketing mechanism, to sort of say, this is who we are. That feels really, really important. And maybe loop back around to you here, Digger, on stuff like, because you mentioned in your last answer, templates and elements of stuff like that. So would you be able to sort of share some of the most useful mechanisms and tactics that you've sort of seen other companies doing when it comes to actually sort of rolling out and getting the rest of the team involved in this? Because I think we've already reframed this in today's session from policing to inspiring, which I find really, really helpful in the first instance, hopefully take some of the heat from it. But in terms of those practical sort of
Yeah.
pieces of collateral, where are you seeing people succeed?
Um, I think I have a pretty good example from because we're kind of in the middle of rolling out a new visual identity ourselves. So we're in the
Nice,
thick of it.
nice.
And also, like we did rolled out the new brand positioning last year. I think it was really interesting because we have this offsite for the entire company.
Hmm.
And culture is in any company important. But I think you can tell if the brand's positioning is rooted in the culture, uh, if people kind of adopt it. And it was so interesting because we did this like brand positioning and we presented it, and there was like this one word that we had somewhere in the brand positioning that somehow, I guess, really resonated with the culture because during that offsite, it just kept coming back again and again and again. So I think for me that was such like a bit of a like an aha moment also. And it's like, oh, if you manage to kind of strike that chord, then people will adopt it and then you don't have to kind of force it. Because I think in the past we had things that were like, yeah, that's good and everything, but it didn't really like roll off the tongue necessarily. And it's kind of like you know when you did right, because then it's effortless almost in like people like wanting to speak with those words or like use those assets or whatever. And I make it sound super easy. Of course it's not, but I think you really need to kind of dig deep into the feelings of the brand almost. Because I think if you can capture that, I think it will become so much easier for anyone that needs to be these ambassadors, as you said, Patrick, of the brand to like feel proud of it and like live it truly. So I think that's kind of maybe that at the strategy part of the process. And then, of course, yes, it's about having like really clear, simple documentation, again, having the materials, giving people just enough creativity, like freedom of creativity in what they create. uh, but then I think then you're just set up in a way that makes it easier also for the brand team to become enablers and not police.
Hmm.
And then also to just like I think as marketing and branding people, you also have to realize that you have to let go of like control issues that you may have. There's no way that you can control it, and you just have to kind of like let it loose a little bit too. So I think that's something that you need to just accept as part of the journey as well.
Hang on. And what I find fascinating about the spirit of this conversation so far is that coming into it, there is a temptation sometimes, I think, to jump to very tactical things, and sort of say, so what you need is a tone of voice document, you need brand guidelines,
Yeah,
you
but
need,
everybody knows that.
yeah, well, maybe, I don't know. But, I think what's really interesting in the conversation with the both of you is you've both gravitated to answers which have been about the feeling of the brand and how people show up to represent the brand. And as ambassadors of the brand, this is how we would like to show up for one another and for the company that we represent. And I think that's a really interesting reframe on this conversation because there's a temptation to sort of say, your top 10 tips for brand consistency are create those documents. But actually, what we're speaking about here is how can we get people on board on an emotional level, not really a practical level, but the practicality follows from the emotion, which I think is a really fascinating point that maybe wouldn't have been obvious right from the beginning.
Oh, it's like that Maya Angelou quote, right? That people remember how you made them feel, not
Yeah.
what you said or whatever it is.
Hmm.
But I mean, I think that's the sentiment of brand in general too. It's about evoking emotions to some extent, even though we tend to not really like to talk about that because it is weird that it is both that and also so business critical at the same time.
Yeah.
So it is that it has that dynamic, which is a bit weird, that it's very emotional, but it's also very business driven somehow.
Hmm.
Um, and I guess that makes it hard to talk about. It's both. It
For
really is.
sure. For sure.
It,
And I,
it's both. It's both, and you need to have the emotion in place first. I think it gives you more buy-in. It galvanizes the culture, and then when a culture is united, employees are more productive, they're more creative, and of course that impacts business as well. So you have I don't know, better campaigns, better products. You're more profitable because everybody's just so engaged and mobilized around that idea, that feeling of the brand. And
Hmm.
that is internally first, right? And then, of course, that exudes externally.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Well, and I think that's it's a fascinating thing. And there's a comment that's come in into the chat feature here today. I'm not going to say it out loud because this goes on to a recording afterwards. So if they don't want to have their name in the recording, I want to make sure that that's respected. But I think it's really interesting, and maybe we could speak through this a little bit. So the chat comment came through and said, I have trouble getting the teams to sit up and listen, getting them to realize how important this is. We have it in place on a OneDrive with all the templates, logos, etc. I wrote a governance doc to help the teams know why we're doing all of this and the reasoning why, etc. But how do we get them to read it and understand it? And this is the crux of what we've been speaking about, really, I think, so far. Is it face-to-face meetings? Is it full company meetings? They've got a business of 105 people, so this is a tough part of their job. So I don't know. I mean, do either of you, and that's a terrible way to sort of start a question on a Zoom, like
I
have
think
any
I do. I think
advice?
I have some thoughts.
Hmm.
Thoughts on what to do. First of all, of course, I do think that you have to put as much love into how you present the documentation and the brand governance documents and everything as you did in creating the brands. So that needs to kind of that love and effort that went into that needs to exude like in the documentation as well. So that's why maybe a OneDrive is like it just sits there with all the other, documents that you have.
Absolutely.
So maybe it's like also giving more visual cues, I think helps also in like showing what it looks like in the wild, basically, to give examples, because I don't think it's top of mind for people who are not in marketing or branding that like the brand is everywhere. It's on the invoices we send to like everything.
Hmm.
So maybe just like giving more of a like showing the brand world to them, show and don't tell. But then the second part is do tell, because I think that there's an element of storytelling that needs to go into it. Where I know I worked with this company in the past. They do brand positioning, is their like niche. And basically, they also work with rolling that out internally since it's a super tiny consultancy. And they always write a one-page story, like really like a literal like fairy tale story almost, that they then share with all of the teams internally, because it's kind of like this old school, also very deep human need to kind of get something put into a bigger context or visualize for you, whether that's through words or pictures or whatever it is. But it's really not just presenting facts, but rather like conveying a message. And I think that's what you kind of, I think that helps. And I think for the person who asked the question, maybe try that and try to like tell the story to get people to understand, and like why did we do this, and like why does this matter, and then use like show what it looks like. That's what I would try at least.
I love that as a that's a really really fabulous mechanism. Thank you so much for sharing that,
I,
Patrick. You
I really like that, having very bite-sized information and to help people understand in a very, very short amount of time what the brand is about. And this links back with the clarity and the simplicity that we do. And the reason that we believe simplifying the message and having a very focused point of view helps is because it gets into people's minds faster and stays there for longer. Plain and simple, right? And that is why you're able to then create a very strong brand because it becomes memorable. It's easy for you to digest. And maybe in those situations, having those bite-sized in, informations about what needs to be done, what needs to be achieved, can be very impactful. I think the other thing comes to mind is the absence of that, right? Because most of the times you're going to say, okay, fine, it's there, but I don't have the time to actually do a roadshow
yeah.
and present to every single person, or people are busy in their own calls or meetings or whatever. If they don't have any incentive of going to the OneDrive and finding the file there But then what's the absence of it? What's the in the opposite scenario? If you don't actually be obsessed about the brand and getting your teams engaged in behind the brand, you don't have a brand.
Mm,
You have
mm,
a commodity. And
absolutely.
then or you have a schizophrenic expression of the brand. I don't know
Mm,
what's worse. All
mm,
right. If you have a commodity, you're not fighting for value, you're fighting for price, you're fighting for cost, and then it's a race to the bottom. You add no value. You have nothing to command over a customer or a consumer,
but,
right? So you completely erode the value of the brand if you don't protect. If and that's for everybody to do, right?
mhm. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. And this is why this stuff matters, right? It's important. It's really, really important. And there's a bunch of questions that have already come into the Q&A, and we're gonna make sure to get to those as well. But I want to pick up on some of the chat comments that have come in because I think in the spirit of a lot of the conversation that we've had so far. So we've had one from Sarah, who, on a very practical level, said we had visual cues in our group channel and set up weekly reminders where everything was stored. And then some hero mentions of the brand from previous weekly tips on how to speak in our brand tone of voice, etc. And what I loved in particular about that comment was that there's Sarah used the word hero mentions. And I think, again, that sort of elevates and looks to showcase the positive elements and get people enthusiastic about this rather than, again, using that word of policing and sort of ticking people off. Because, in fact, the top question in the Q&A right now is, how do you handle those conversations with colleagues who think they are right when it comes to branding, but are actually really wrong? And I think there's like these moments of celebrating people is probably going to be a really, really important part of it, showing it where it's done well, getting people involved in the story, all of these things. They all feel very, very important. So thank you for sharing those tips, Sarah. The chat, by the way, is always lovely, and there's some really, really great tips coming in from the community as well. So thank you all so much for sharing. As ever, you're just wonderful. So let's take a couple more questions from me, just because I've got a couple about like evolving the brand, because I think that's probably important to recognize when brand consistency is actually not helping us and that we need to change. But then we'll head straight into the community Q&A afterwards. So folks, if you have any questions, do drop them in the Q&A and we'll make sure to prioritize those in the rest of the time that we have. So Patrick, if I come to you first, I'd just love to know, and I'd love to know as well from you, Digger, in a moment, what was the prompting point to sort of redevelop the visual identity for you. But Patrick, how do we start to think about evolving brands? And because we're very much a proponent here of a brand showing up in the same shape consistently, but how do we know when to sort of start flexing on this kind of stuff?
That's the key word. It's flexibility, right? And flexibility within the framework.
Mm-hmm,
That's how we call it. There's the guidelines and things that you got to respect about the expression of the brand, but there's still that 10%, 15% that should flex across different channels
mm-hmm,
or even as time passes, right? You gotta adjust course, mainly according to the different needs of the channels or the different needs of the audience that might have evolved as well.
mm-hmm.
So just knowing that you gotta bake in a little wiggle room for the brand to live and breathe, right? It's not a static thing. It shouldn't be. Even in the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about iconic brands being built across decades and sometimes even centuries of years. They still have minor adaptations and they had shown flexibility to evolve a little bit as well,
Mm-hmm.
whilst maintaining consistency.
And I'll follow up on that because there's an obvious follow-up question in my mind, which is how do you know what that 10 or 15% is? Because I could imagine if I was a brand guardian getting quite grumpy about that 10 or 15%, but I might be misplaced because I don't understand the nuance of TikTok, where actually a slightly more unhinged brand sort of presence is beneficial and native to that platform. So do you have experience in sort of like knowing where that 10 or 15% is? Because that feels quite important.
Most of the times it's channel specific, so where that brand is going to be lived, where you're gonna be able to find that brand and interact with it. Of course, in digital, you can have so many different formats. You mentioned TikTok is different than Facebook, that it's different than LinkedIn, that is different than the format that you would have on YouTube and so on and so forth. So you gotta you gotta you gotta know the rules of engagement for each
Mm-hmm.
of those different channels. It's easier a little bit when you're talking about out of home or a print ad or a static campaign, where it's much easier for you to control or even have some sort of agency of the assets in those moments. But digitally, yeah, then you gotta follow the directions of each of the channels.
Nice. That's perfect. And Digger, I mean, it sounds like you're going through this exact moment, and so this is maybe more of a word associated with iterating rather than evolving. But what was the thought process? And feel free to share as much or as little as you want, because I haven't asked your permission here to sort of share the story of this
Yeah.
refresh. But um, how did you end up in this place where you're like, actually, a visual identity? This is the moment now to kind of look at this and evolve the brand or iterate the brand.
I think a couple of reasons. Obviously, I think if your company like ours, we're a scale up, we've been around for 11-ish years, and you grow so fast, and then you kind of enter new markets, and then, I mean, things change so quickly. So sometimes you kind of evolve one part, and then you realize, oh, I need this part also needs
Mhm.
to kind of match
Yeah.
this. So I think that was very simply put the situation that we found ourselves in, that it's oh, we need to evolve how we talk about the product and how we talk about this. And then, okay, that needs to be matched with like the visual language that goes with that. And so it was kind of like, and then I think realized, okay, let's do like a bit of a bigger take on all of this and roll that out. But I mean, it's leading up to this conversation, I was actually thinking a lot about like what companies have managed to be consistent over time. And yes, you have the Apples and everyone where you can see there's something so distinctive. And it's always tempting to use those examples because they're so successful. And I was trying to think of a company that's maybe not as big and huge and successful as the brands as Apple. And it is hard because I think most companies or most brands at some point kind of need to do a bit of a refresh and kind of like a redo of who they are and to stay relevant. And there are
Mhm.
few, I found it hard to find companies, like there aren't that many examples of companies that are just like very consistent over time. Obviously, I immediately, because I'm Swedish and I love them, I thought about IKEA because I think they've done an amazing job when it comes to their brand and being very consistent over time. But, it's like if you think of like smaller companies and um I mean, you see also like the car industry struggling right now, and then some of them coming out with new brands that this is kind of this like fireworks now, but I wonder like when are they going to change that again? So so I think it's this it goes back to having a very clear sense of what your core is, I think.
Mm.
And I think that's what sets a company like Apple, who very much has design at their core, or IKEA or whoever. I think that's kind of part of the success. And obviously there are other brands that live that too, where it's really having something. It goes back to your question about fixed versus flexibility, but having something that is so uniquely you kind of, or something
Mhm.
that's very true to who you are as a company and a brand. And then you can kind of that can evolve over time. And as Patrick said, also, of course, you have to adapt to the context. Like context is everything for a brand as well. But just like go into the room with your own personality, but maybe,
A version of it, and it's such a important point because I I find that answer so interesting in the context of the answer itself, but also the wider conversation because you've pointed to a moment where perhaps this language is too strong to describe your situation, but like where the current branding uh, doesn't serve you as well as it possibly could.
Yeah.
And the factors which you discussed there were quite practical ones, you know. So we are a scale up, and we you know, needed to make this adjustment for this new market, or we needed to adjust it in this way because it was, you know, not serving us in this way. So there's quite a practical thing there. But then it struck me that one of your earlier answers was about the emotional one, where you were speaking about listening to the feedback that you were getting from folks,
Yeah.
and those moments where people really resonated with your brand and sort of went, oh yeah, that, you know, this was the
Yeah.
offsite moment and this was the word. And
Yeah.
you know, that progression as well, you know, there's an emotional progression or there can be a practical progression which sort of says this represents who we are right now. And
Yeah.
so I don't know, I found both of your insights there just really, really interesting, you know, allowing the 10 to 15%, but also being vigilant about these things on a practical or an emotional level, sort of asking the question, do these represent us still? I think
Yeah.
that's really, really fabulous. Thank you both. I found that really, really helpful. Let's head to the community's Q&A because they are the most important people here today. So we should make sure to make sure to answer those questions. Folks, the last encouragement from me in this session will be just to give a thumbs up to any questions that you would love us to prioritize, because we will. So in the Q&A feature, just found in your little toolbar. So the first question comes from Anne Marie, and I've already referenced it, but it's that awkward one. So how do you handle those conversations with colleagues who think they're right when it comes to branding, but are actually really wrong? Um, Patrick's looking to the heavens right now, and I don't mean to be cruel, but I'm going to come to you first on this.
That's
So,
fine. Right or wrong is subjective, right? But I think um, is being able to adapt how you're going to reach different stakeholders by knowing what's important to them. So the difficulty for a particular set of stakeholder might be that that person thinks that they're a designer and they know how to kind of go about and change and because they think that they have taste and they put things together and they look nice. So they might say, okay, fine, you don't need to lecture me on this. I know what I'm doing. That is one thing. Another thing is if you go to I don't know, a business meeting and there's the C-level, there's a sales director, and the person is skeptical of brand. Like, hey,
mm,
this mumbo jumbo doesn't help me at all. All I need to do is sell more. So that person doesn't know that they can use brand as an instrument of business to then help him have an easier job, an easier lift because he's leveraging a stronger brand. So it's just knowing which levers to pull
mm,
when you're approaching different audiences inside the company, what's important to them instead of you just trying to push your agenda because somebody might not understand it.
absolutely, bang on. We're doing a marketing job, in you know, and so I really, really love that. Do you have anything to add there at all, or
No, I mean, I think Patrick had some really good points. I would like obviously it depends on who you talk to, as Patrick said. Sometimes that's also an internal discussion, like in marketing, even because it's like Patrick said, like opinions are subjective, and people might think. So I think and I think someone in the community called that out also, which was what did they call it? Like a hero,
yeah,
yeah,
like,
which I like. I like that idea of maybe like maybe agreeing on what good looks like.
hmm
Sometimes that like unlocks certain discussions, I think, as well. If you can kind of talk about like, but what's the ideal state here? Or like, what do we think, what would good look like? And then you can maybe like work your way back from there. Or if you can establish that baseline or understanding in the group, then I think that helps. But obviously, there will also be stakeholders in any company that might not, they might have opinions, but it's maybe not also their job to decide.
Hmm.
And then I think it's just like, sure, I'll listen to your opinions, but in the end, maybe it's not their decision. I mean, I think it's always good to listen. It's always good to have very close relationships with any kind of especially customer facing teams to get that input. But in the end, I think it's also marketing and the brand team's job. So I think you have to like listen, but also, yeah, you don't have to take everything on either all the time. I think you could have some pride in your, in your role and what your expertise is in this area too, and like know why you made certain decisions, because obviously you did not make them because you just think that color is cool. It's because it plays a role,
Absolutely.
and it has like, so yeah.
Absolutely. Well, marketing, sorry, business is a team sport, right?
Yeah.
And so it's exactly that, that there's a humility in opening your ears, but there's also, as exactly as you say, a pride in sort of knowing that these things are there for a reason, and that's also good to carry with you. Um,
Yeah.
I love this question that's come in from James, and I'll head back over to you as well, Digger, on this, which is that often when we speak about brands, we speak about imagery and logos and stuff like that. But James is asking here about the best way to help your team understand the brand language, so the words that we use when we show up out there in the world. So I can either ask you from a best practice perspective or even a personal perspective here on how do you help teams understand the language that we should be using when we're showing up.
Well, obviously you do need to have guidelines for that, but I don't
Hmm.
think guidelines in itself is not gonna do the job. I think you need again to have something that makes sense. Like it needs to resonate with people, and that goes back to the whole feeling discussion again about like people feeling like this is like the right tone of voice for us. Um, and then I think we also have like one of our cooperators, she's lovely. She has like a little copy clinic on Slack,
Nice.
where she gives people like little bite-sized, and I think it goes back to something you said before, Patrick, bite-sized courses in like, this is how we write this. And she does it really well. So it kind of becomes like fun and more like just like, hey, you know that we do this. So it's kind of like a little, she teaches people, but in a very nice, friendly way. And I think that helps. But obviously, yes, like it has to be, people need to be able to grasp it and feel that it makes sense. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard.
Yeah.
But I agree. You tend to think of like logos and imagery, and I think in general, I do. I've had this conversation a lot with our creative director that brands are not like brands are a vibe, and you have to understand that that's what it is. It's a vibe. It's not, like actual things necessarily. And you have to, I guess, this is probably not a very helpful answer to the person who asked the question, but I guess you need to convey what the vibe is.
Hmm.
If that
No,
makes sense.
well,
If you can do that in any way, I think that helps. If people know what the vibe is, but I mean, I think that's essentially what people need to understand the vibe.
yeah,
Yeah,
we know what you mean, and because we can't go through the dictionary and sort of say we're not going to use this word, but we are going to use this one,
yeah,
and
yeah,
I think.
I think you could have principles that then
Mhm.
apply to how you speak, right? You
Nice.
can have some tips and tricks. You can have before and after examples. So this is current state brand written without any specific tone of voice. When you apply it, see how it looked, see how it changed,
Hmm.
and what are the mechanisms that we did in order to create that change. So you have a very stark contrast of before and after. And I think it's coherence, right? Because language is visually but also verbally, right? It's you gotta marry both. And brands are about communication, so it doesn't matter And if you don't have, if you just go all in on the visuals and you don't pay attention to the verbal, you're not going to have a strong brand as you could have had. So yeah, it's super important. It's a great question, actually.
It's a fabulous. I obsess over this particular element of it because, as established, I am terrible at drawing. But like, I'm not a visual character. But
No, I'll give you an example. Just think of Oatly.
Mhm,
Oatly drinks. It's a beautiful tone of voice. It's quirky. You see it in the packaging how they write. Um, Liquid death water.
mhm,
Murder your thirst. But it's rebellious. It's irreverent. It's
mhm.
tone of voice. It's beautiful. It's amazing. It cuts through, right? It's not squeaky clean Nestle water. It's different, and
Absolutely.
it's just purely voice, purely voice.
100%. I couldn't agree more. I get pretty, I really enjoy this element of what we do, and I think your point about principles there is really really helpful. I mean, at TMM, one of ours is just about being elevating, and so you'll never sort of hear us sort of shout down people. We'll always speak about the good example rather than sort of shouting at the bad example, and the language that sort of comes associated with that is really really important. And so I think that's a great point and one that I can relate to as well in how we run our business. Patrick, let's take this one to you if it's okay. So the next question comes in from Melanie, who asks, what is the best way to approach stakeholders who have no experience in branding or marketing, but insist on their personal opinions being acted on? Um, and we've had a version of this question, but feel like it's a slightly different one because here it sounds a bit more directive. It's like you have to do this rather than I have an opinion, and that I may or may not actually believe it. But this is like founder, CEO, boss vibes.
I think the key word there is acted upon. So it's one thing is to hear their opinions
Hmm.
and to welcome thoughts and to collaborate. Another thing is if that person has an expectation, just because they voiced out some comment, that actually is going to be acted upon. And I think this is where you have to draw the line, and this is where you have to say, okay, fine, look, at the end of the day, I'm running this and I'm the expert in this, but I'm going to listen to you and I'm going to understand not just you, but also the different perspectives of the business, because it ultimately is going to help me make a better informed decision for the business,
Hmm.
right? That's
Hmm.
about it. I think there are different ways that you can position it. As you mentioned, it's not about being the definitive, um, I don't know
Source of truth, the
exactly,
person, yeah.
exactly, but showing that you're willing to accommodate, that you're willing to listen. But at the end of the day, it's you and your team who's going to make the decision.
Absolutely. Love it. I
I
think
think,
that firmness is so allowed. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, just to build on that, I think sometimes it also helps to kind of maybe explain a little bit more to people, like give people more insights, because I think a lot of times people also assume things,
Mm.
and they assume that it works a certain way, or they just see like a sliver of what you're doing, and just more transparency sometimes also helps, I feel. One of the things that I did last year was I created a deck where I kind of tried to break down how marketing works in our company,
Nice.
which I called How the Sausage is Made. So we started calling it Sausage Deck, not a beautiful name for it. But it was actually quite helpful because I was just like really like very basic, like, okay, we do this and it costs this much money and this, so you get down like that helped actually, I
Mhm.
felt, because it gave people more context basically, and just shed more light on like the bigger picture of how it works. So I think sometimes just transparency, like just like upfront transparency helps also to share what you're actually doing. If you want to kind of maybe preempt some of those questions. But if you're asking for budget, you're
Mhm.
always gonna have those questions. That's not gonna go away. So brace yourself. That's gonna be the case anyway. Yeah.
I love
There's
that. And
also those situations that people don't understand anything about brand, and you have to really take a 101 course. Like, what is a brand? What is not a brand? A brand is not a logo, right? A brand is not a typography or those types of things. So that's just the external manifestation of the brand. A brand is about this, this, and this, and you got to bring them along. It's always fun. At least I love it.
You know what? You've both done something which is fabulous because you've somehow managed to answer the first question which I asked, but then the next question um, in the Q&A was asking how do you explain to those who are not familiar with modern marketing best practices why consistency on clarity and brand voice is important. So you managed to answer both of the top questions in one answer. So I'm gonna clap my hands at your competence today. So thank you both. I really really appreciate that answer. I think that was fabulous. Could I just have some follow up on it though? Because I love that presentation on how the sausage is made.
Yeah.
Were you surprised by any of the questions that you got, or any of the things where the penny dropped in a moment where you were surprised that the penny would have dropped?
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, yes, in some areas, but I think that says more about me, maybe.
okay.
Or well, I think it just goes to show again that you just see things from your own perspective and you assume, I
Yeah,
assumed that people would know more. And then when you take a step back and realize, well, why would they? It's not their job to know exactly how marketing works. So it's a good learning experience for me too.
I love that. Well, even just as a quote, we were laughing before we started today's session that we needed lots of 5 to 10 second snippets, and I like the one that it's not their job to understand how marketing works. Is
Yeah.
That's a good one. So thank you. As we wrap up in the last 2 minutes, the session's been fabulous. So thank you both. Let's take the last one from Sarah. So Sarah asks, how would you start moving towards a more consistent brand approach in a company that's been using it very inconsistently? What would be the best first step for each of you? And then that will be us for the hour. So the best first step in bringing consistency to inconsistency. Patrick, if we start with you.
Uh, Start small, but do it often. I think it's not about boiling the ocean because otherwise it it can get overwhelming, and then eventually you're gonna drop out and not do it. But look for a few things, core things that are non-negotiables, and
Mhm.
enforce them first. And then as you start as an organization to get used to it, then you're able to kind of, expand a little bit more of the things that you want to keep consistent on. But I would say start small.
Love that. There you go.
I think that was such a great answer. I don't have anything to add. I mean, that's probably what I would say too. Like,
Mhm.
obviously it's about just like little releases or snippets or bites, tapas, whatever you want to call it, that you
Mhm.
feed people with more good, brand pieces
Mhm.
that enable people to use it correctly. And then you can hopefully also sunset the old inconsistent stuff.
That's perfect. Brand tapas, as Sarah says in the chat, which is fabulous. Thank you both. Thank you both so much. Like, there's been so much useful stuff today shared, and there's a comment in the chat feature amongst a lot of thank yous from Bethan who said this has been brilliant. I have multiple pages of notes, which is just so fabulous. So thank you both for sharing the thoughts in your brain and the experience that you've both earned so hard. So I really really appreciate it, and thank you as ever to the community. You are unbelievably amazing, and so thank you for supporting each other as you have in the chat and for contributing questions. I hope that we've really helped you bring some brand consistency to everything you do. Um, so with all that said, just a big, well, first of all, an encouragement to connect with our speakers today. So if you haven't already, do say hello. Um, but also a big thank you to all of our sponsors for bringing these sessions. Like, we wouldn't be able to run our community if it wasn't for these incredible folks. And these are brands on a screen, but there are human beings behind each of these brands who support us and make sure that we can continue to support you. So a big thank you to them as well. we'll be back next Tuesday with another session all about rebranding and the mistakes that folks make when doing so. But in the meantime, we'll see you next week. And thank you so much today to everyone
Bye.
involved.
Thanks
Take
for
care.
having me. Bye bye. Take care. Thank you. Appreciate it.